She thought she had control. She thought she was doing her job. But when Officer Linda Carson strikes a black driver during a routine stop, she learns the hard way that assumptions can destroy everything. The night had been quiet so far, the kind of shift Officer Linda Carson didn't mind. It was late, just past 10 p.m., and most of the traffic in this part of Columbus had slowed to a trickle. She sat in her cruiser, parked near an empty lot, watching the occasional car roll by. Then she saw it, a sleek black sedan gliding through the intersection ahead. It was one of those expensive models, the kind that looked like it belonged in a CEO's driveway. Nothing about it seemed out of place, except for one small thing. No turn signal. Technically, it was a violation. A minor one, sure, but still a reason to stop the driver. And maybe, just maybe, Linda felt like reminding people that rules were rules. She pulled onto the street, accelerating just enough to close the distance. A quick flick of her lights. The sedan's brake lights flared as it slowed, then smoothly pulled over to the side. Linda took her time stepping out, one hand on her belt, the other adjusting her radio. The street was quiet, only the low hum of streetlights above and the occasional car in the distance. As she approached the driver's side window, the glass rolled down with an almost deliberate slowness. And there he was. A black man, mid-40s, neatly trimmed beard, tailored navy suit. He looked expensive, like someone who knew he belonged in a car like this. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers barely twitching as he glanced at her. Linda felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't like the way he looked at her. Not nervous, not apologetic, just waiting. License and registration. Her voice came out firmer than necessary. The man blinked once, then reached toward his glove compartment. Slow, controlled, like he already knew what she was thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was smooth, even. Linda crossed her arms. "Failed to signal a turn back there." A beat passed. A quiet breath. "Did I?" Her eyes flickered over him. Something about his tone. It wasn't disrespectful, wasn't aggressive, but it was challenging in a way she didn't like. "License and registration," she repeated. He handed them over without another word, his movements steady. No shaking hands, no frantic explanation. She glanced at the ID, barely reading the name before turning it over. That attitude, calm, confident. It irked her. "You live around here?" she asked. The man exhaled through his nose, barely a sigh, but enough to feel like a statement. "I don't see how that's relevant." Linda's grip on his ID tightened. She had been on the force for over a decade, long enough to know when someone wasn't taking her seriously. Long enough to know when someone thought they could get away with something. She straightened. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the man's expression changed. His jaw set, his head tilting slightly. "Why?" "I asked you to step out." A muscle in his cheek twitched, but he didn't argue. He just sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed the door open. Linda stepped back as he stood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered. There was no tension in his stance, no aggression, but something in his presence made her pulse tick up a notch. She gestured toward the back of the car. "Hands on the trunk." The man exhaled through his nose again, a slow, deliberate breath, before turning to place his palms flat against the cool metal. Linda's heart pounded. She could feel the shift now, the shift in power. This was her moment to remind him who was in charge. She reached forward, pressing a hand against his back, guiding him down just slightly. He stiffened, and that was when something inside her snapped. Before she even thought about it, before she even registered what she was doing, her palm struck his cheek. A sharp, stinging crack that echoed in the empty street. The man's head jerked to the side, his body freezing completely. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Linda's own breath hitched. For a second, the world felt still. Then, slowly, he turned his head back to her, his face unreadable. His jaw clenched just once before he took a steady breath. And then, in the most controlled, deliberate movement, he reached into his jacket pocket. Linda's stomach twisted. He pulled out his ID, held it up. Nathaniel Grant. Her eyes flickered down, scanning the title beneath his name. Chief of Police. Her superior. Linda's pulse roared in her ears. Her fingers went numb. The ground beneath her felt like it had just cracked wide open. And standing right in front of her, Nathaniel Grant just watched. But this was far from over. Linda felt her body lock up. It was like her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Chief of Police. Not just any cop. Not just some desk officer or a detective from another precinct. Her boss. She had struck her boss. Nathaniel Grant still held up his ID, his fingers loose around the edges, but his expression didn't change. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding an explanation. He was just looking at her. And somehow, that was worse. Linda's breath came short. A dozen thoughts clashed in her head, none of them forming into words. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding like a drum against her ribs. Chief Grant, She stopped. There was no good way to finish that sentence, no excuse that wouldn't sound desperate. A voice cut through the thick silence. "Everything okay here, Officer Carson?" She turned sharply. Another patrol car had pulled up behind hers, the blue and red lights throwing fractured colors across the pavement. Officer Reynolds, her usual partner, stood just a few feet away, eyebrows drawn together in confusion. Linda opened her mouth, but Grant spoke first. "Fine," he said smoothly, slipping his ID back into his pocket. "Your officer here was just conducting a stop." Reynolds glanced between them, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, Grant didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on Linda. "Am I free to go?" he asked. Linda hesitated. Her fingers twitched at her sides. This was it. This was the moment. Say yes. Let him leave. Hope he doesn't file a report. Or double down. Try to take back control. She wet her lips. A low chuckle rumbled from Grant's throat. Not amusement. Not anger. Just something cold. "Officer Carson," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Are you detaining me?" Linda felt the weight of Reynolds' stare now, confusion shifting to concern. He didn't know. He hadn't seen what happened. The words burned her throat. "No, sir." Grant exhaled, slow and measured, before glancing toward Reynolds. "Good to see the department still has some professionals." Then, without another word, he stepped back toward his car, slid into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut. Linda couldn't move as the black sedan eased back onto the road and disappeared into the night. But the moment the car was gone, Reynolds turned to her. "Linda, what the hell was that?" She felt her jaw clench. "It was just a stop." Reynolds's brows furrowed. "Just a stop. You looked like you saw a ghost. What did he say to you?" "Nothing." That was the problem. Grant hadn't said anything. No threats, no warnings, just a lingering silence that crushed her more than yelling ever could. She shook her head. "Nothing. Forget it." Reynolds studied her for a second longer, before exhaling. "I'll write up the stop. You good?" Linda swallowed. Was she? "Yeah." He hesitated, then nodded, heading back to his cruiser. Linda turned back toward her own, but as she reached for the door handle, she felt something heavy settle in her gut. Nathaniel Grant had let her walk away. No scene, no immediate consequences. But he wasn't done with her yet, and she knew it. Linda barely slept that night. She lay stiff in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The way Grant had looked at her, the way he had let her go. No shouting, no threats, no immediate consequences, just that silence. Heavy, deliberate. It would have been easier if he had yelled, easier if he had pulled rank and humiliated her on the spot. At least then she would have known where she stood. But instead she was left waiting. By morning, her stomach was knotted so tight it hurt. She got dressed, her hands shaking as she buttoned her uniform. Maybe it would blow over. Maybe Grant had decided not to report it. Maybe... Her phone buzzed. A single message from the precinct's Internal Affairs Department. "Report to the chief's office. Immediately." Linda's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. She drove to the station in silence, her grip stiff on the wheel. As soon as she walked in, she could feel eyes on her. Officers milling by the break room, the front desk clerk barely looking up. Nothing had been said yet, but she knew how these things worked. Word always got around. She took the elevator up, the seconds stretching like hours. The hallway to Grant's office felt longer than it should have. She forced herself to breathe as she reached for the handle and stepped inside. Grant was at his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up, but someone else was already there. Captain Howard, a man who had been with the department for over 20 years, stood off to the side, arms crossed, face unreadable. The air in the room shifted. Grant finally looked up. "Officer Carson," he said evenly. "Sit." Her legs felt stiff as she lowered into the chair across from him. Grant leaned back, clasping his hands together. His face didn't give anything away. Calm, measured, in control. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "Tell me," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "How would you report last night's stop?" Linda swallowed. A test. Her throat felt dry. "Routine stop for failure to signal." Grant nodded like he expected that answer. "And what happened next?" Her pulse pounded in her ears. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't pushing, just waiting. "Asked for ID. The driver was uncooperative." Grant's brow lifted just slightly. Uncooperative? Linda's jaw clenched. He questioned why he was being stopped. There was a beat of silence. Grant turned to Captain Howard. "Would you say questioning an officer is considered uncooperative?" Howard barely blinked. "Not unless the driver refuses to comply." Grant's eyes slid back to her. "Did I refuse to comply, Officer Carson?" Linda felt her hands dig into her thighs. "No, sir." Grant exhaled through his nose, nodding. And then, her stomach twisted. The moment she had been dreading. She tried to keep her voice even. "I struck the suspect." "Suspect?" Grant repeated, a sharp edge creeping into his tone. Linda didn't answer. Grant studied her, then leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk. "Why did you hit me, Officer Carson?" The question sank into her like a hook. Howard remained silent, his gaze heavy on her. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. Grant's voice remained steady, but something cold sat beneath it. "Did you feel threatened?" "No, sir." "Did I resist?" "No, sir." "Did I insult you?" Linda's stomach churned. Grant held her gaze. "Then what exactly made you strike me?" The room felt too small, the walls too close, her throat locked up. "You don't have an answer," Grant murmured. He didn't yell, didn't call her a racist, didn't say anything she hadn't already thought about all night. Instead, he let the silence crush her. Finally, Grant straightened. He took a breath, then slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Her heart stopped. A suspension notice. "You're off duty until further notice," he said simply. Linda's hands shook as she reached for it. "Chief Grant, I—" But he was already standing. Dismissed. Linda felt like she was sinking. She stood, barely remembering how to walk. Her legs felt like they weren't attached to her body. She barely noticed Captain Howard opening the door for her, but as she stepped out, Grant spoke one last time. "We're not done," and she knew he meant it. Linda sat on her couch, staring at the suspension notice in her hands. She had read it over at least 10 times, but the words never changed. Indefinite administrative leave, pending review. The weight of it settled in her chest. She had never been suspended before, not once in her 15 years on the force, and now all she could do was wait. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. For a second she thought about ignoring it, but when she glanced at the screen her stomach dropped. Nathaniel Grant. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen before finally answering. "Carson." A pause. Then, "Meet me at Riverside Park. 10 minutes." The call ended before she could say a word. Her pulse was a mess as she pulled on her jacket and headed out the door. Riverside Park was nearly empty when she arrived. A few people jogging, a couple sitting on a bench, a man walking his dog. The streetlights flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows. And then she saw him. Nathaniel Grant stood near the edge of the park, hands in his pockets, watching the river move under the bridge. He didn't look up as she approached. For a second she considered walking away, but something about the way he stood there, calm, unreadable, kept her feet moving. She stopped a few feet away. "You called me," she said. Grant nodded, still not looking at her. "Do you know why I didn't report you to IA myself?" Linda swallowed. She had wondered that. Wondered why it had been handled so quietly. Grant finally turned to face her. "Because I wanted you to sit with it first. Feel it." Her jaw tensed. "I do." "No, you don't." His voice was level, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Not yet." Linda crossed her arms. "Then what is this?" Grant studied her for a long moment before nodding toward a bench. "Sit." She hesitated, but something in his tone made it clear. This wasn't a request. She sat. He followed, resting his elbows on his knees, staring out at the water. Then he spoke. "You ever been pulled over, Carson?" Linda blinked. "What?" "A routine stop," Grant clarified. "Ever had a cop flash their lights at you? Ask for your license? Ask you where you're going?" She shook her head. "I mean, maybe once or twice." Grant exhaled through his nose. "I've lost count." Linda's stomach tightened. "Every city I've lived in," he continued, "I've had cops stop me, ask me why I was there, even in my own damn neighborhood." Linda didn't know what to say. Grant leaned back against the bench. "You hit me because you were frustrated, but ask yourself, why was I frustrating you?" She knew the answer. She just didn't want to say it. Grant didn't let her off the hook. "Because I didn't act afraid of you." Her chest felt tight. "You expected me to be nervous, to scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something," Grant said, watching her closely. "And when I didn't, when I stayed calm, it made you mad." Linda's throat felt dry. Grant shook his head. "You don't see it, do you? You don't see how deep it runs." She clenched her jaw. "I'm not racist," Grant finished for her. "Maybe not. But what do you call it when you assume someone's a threat just for existing?" The words hit hard. For a long time neither of them spoke. The sounds of the river, the distant hum of the city, filled the silence. Finally, Grant sighed. "I didn't ask you here to tear you apart. I asked you here because you've got a choice to make." Linda frowned. "What choice?" Grant turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake." His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "Or you can sit with it, really sit with it, and ask yourself why it happened." Linda looked away, staring at the water. Grant stood. "When Internal Affairs calls you back in, they're going to ask if you've learned anything." He took a step back. "Figure out what your answer's going to be." And just like that, he walked away. Linda sat there, watching his back disappear into the night. And for the first time since the stop, she let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. But this wasn't over yet. Linda spent the next 3 days drowning in silence. Her phone barely rang. No calls from the precinct. No texts from her usual work friends. No updates. It was as if she had been wiped clean from the department overnight. She should have been relieved. Should have been grateful for the time to think. But thinking was the problem. Nathaniel Grant's words stuck to her like oil. "You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake, or you can sit with it." She had told herself she wasn't that kind of cop. She had never been reckless, never let her emotions control her, but that night, she had. And now, the weight of it wouldn't let go. On the 4th day, the call finally came. "Internal Affairs. Report in." Linda's hands were clammy as she gripped the wheel, driving to the station. The sun was out, but it did nothing to shake the chill in her gut. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt the eyes again. Officers at their desks, a few glances exchanged in hushed conversations. They knew. She kept her head down as she made her way to the conference room. The door was already open. Inside, 3 people sat waiting. Captain Howard, an IA investigator named Harris, and Nathaniel Grant. He didn't look at her as she stepped in, just kept his hands folded on the table, staring at the file in front of him. Linda swallowed hard and sat. Harris leaned forward. "Officer Carson, let's talk about the stop from last week." Her throat was dry. "Yes, sir." "According to your statement," Harris continued, flipping through the papers, "you pulled the driver over for a failure to signal. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." Harris nodded. "And at what point did you escalate to physical force?" Linda's stomach twisted. She could feel Grant's presence across the table, his silence just as loud as the question itself. She swallowed. "I struck the driver after asking him to step out of the vehicle." "Why?" The word landed hard. Linda had rehearsed this in her head 100 times, but every excuse, every justification, suddenly felt hollow. Her lips pressed together. "I lost my temper." Captain Howard shifted in his chair. Harris's brow lifted slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to say it so plainly. Harris flipped to another page. "You wrote here that you felt the driver was being uncooperative." Linda's hands curled into fists under the table. She exhaled. "I assumed he was resisting when he wasn't." For the first time, Grant looked up. Their eyes met. "Assumed," he repeated. Linda felt the weight of that word. Silence stretched between them. Then Harris cleared his throat. "Chief Grant, do you have anything to add?" Grant sat back in his chair. He studied her for a moment, then exhaled. "Not yet." Harris closed the file. "Officer Carson, here's where we are. You've been on the force for 15 years with no prior disciplinary action. That works in your favor. However, this was an unjustified use of force. That's not something we can ignore." Linda felt her pulse pick up. Harris continued, "You are looking at a minimum suspension of 60 days without pay. Additionally, you'll be required to attend de-escalation and bias training. A second offense of this nature will result in termination." Linda let out a slow breath. It wasn't good news, but it wasn't the end either. She nodded. "Understood." Harris stood, gathering his files. "We'll finalize the paperwork. You're dismissed." Linda rose from her seat, but Grant didn't move. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she reached the door, he finally spoke. "Carson." She stopped. Grant's voice was calm, even, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "This isn't over." Linda didn't turn around. She just gripped the doorknob, forcing herself to breathe, because deep down she knew he was right, and the real work hadn't even started yet. Linda sat in her car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. 60 days. No pay. Bias training. Could have been worse. Should have been worse. She had expected anger. Resentment. Maybe even relief that she hadn't lost her job completely. But none of those emotions came. Instead, there was something heavier, something she had been avoiding since the moment Grant locked eyes with her that night. Shame. She had assumed. She had reacted. She had abused her authority. And she had gotten away with a slap on the wrist. Grant was right. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The first day of training was humiliating. The room was small, with about a dozen other officers. Some rookies, some veterans like her. No one spoke much. No one wanted to be there. The instructor was a retired detective, an older black woman named Joanna Pierce. She looked over the room, her expression unreadable, then clicked the projector remote. A traffic stop video played. Linda watched in silence. The footage was grainy, taken from a body cam, but the story was clear. A black man, pulled over for a minor infraction. The officer, white, just like her, escalated the situation, voice sharp, tone clipped. The man kept his hands visible, his voice calm, but it didn't matter. The officer's frustration grew, tension rising. And then the officer grabbed him. The room stayed silent as the video ended. Joanna crossed her arms. "Let's talk about assumptions." No one spoke. She let the silence stretch. Then she turned, her eyes locking onto Linda. "Carson," she said, her voice even. "What did the officer see when he pulled that man over?" Linda's throat tightened. She knew the answer. "He saw a threat," she said quietly. Joanna nodded. "And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Grant?" Linda's breath felt heavy. The words came out barely above a whisper. A threat. Joanna tilted her head. And was he? Linda swallowed. No. Joanna leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. Then where did that idea come from? The question burned through her. Where had it come from? Was it the way she had been trained? The subtle messages picked up over the years? The idea that certain people in certain places didn't belong? Linda had spent her whole career telling herself she wasn't biased, that she treated everyone the same. But that night with Grant had proved something she didn't want to admit. It wasn't true. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time she wasn't looking away from the question. Joanna held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. Good. Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Because for the first time since that night, she wasn't fighting the truth. She was facing it. 2 months later, Linda walked back into the precinct. Everything felt the same, yet different. The station hummed with the usual noise, phones ringing, boots against tile, the low murmur of officers exchanging reports. But there was something in the air when people saw her. Not pity, not judgment, just watching. She didn't blame them. She made her way toward her desk, setting her things down. But before she could sit, a shadow passed by. Nathaniel Grant. He didn't stop. Didn't say anything. Just walked toward his office. But then right at the door he hesitated, turned his head slightly. Carson. She stiffened. Sir. A pause. Then, welcome back. Linda swallowed. Thank you. Grant nodded once, then stepped inside his office, shutting the door behind him. And for the first time in weeks, Linda breathed. She had been given a second chance. What she did with it was up to her. Prejudice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with slurs or open hatred. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just assumptions, split-second decisions based on nothing but fear and conditioning. The question isn't whether or not it exists. The question is whether or not you're willing to face it. And if you are, what will you do about it? If this story made you think, share it. Let's have the conversations that actually matter.